A young person went up to a wise church leader. The young person said to this church leader, "Tell me, O wise church leader, what does one have to do to become an effective leader in the church?" She answered, "Oh, it's a challenging task. First, you must cultivate spiritual disciplines on a regular basis. Be a person of prayer on a regular basis, setting aside time for your relationship with God. Cultivate that in a way that becomes a habit that shapes your daily life. Second, you must learn the contours, the content, and the shape of the Christian faith. You must be a person for whom the very gospel is a second language as if it was your first, that you are fluent in that content and can articulate it wherever you are in whatever settings that you might find yourself. And third, you must become committed to making disciples of Jesus Christ through effective strategic leadership, being a disciple yourself and knowing how to equip all the saints for ministry in their own discipleship. Then and only then will you be equipped for effective leadership in the church." After she finished, the young man said, "Oh, whatever happened to wholesome good looks and a nice personality?" We have for too long tried to think that somehow we could rely on wholesome good looks and a nice personality in the church, on presumptions of being nice, of being kind, as a way to deal with the call of the gospel, a way of bearing witness to God, of providing the kind of leadership that the gospel demands, expects, invites, and seduces of us. Instead of cultivating those spiritual disciplines, being people of prayer that focus our sights on heaven, we have, alas, all too often become those people that Gregory the Great in his book Pastoral Care calls the crook-backed. People so burdened by the daily tasks we face, the daily challenges, that we are now weighed down and bent over, and we've forgotten how to look up to heaven. In those ways, we've become like practical atheists, effective perhaps at paying attention to the daily, but not in ways that focus our attention on God, that bear witness to God's grace and God's reign, that keep us centered in God. We've settled for being crook-backed. Instead of learning the Christian faith in all of its complexity and richness and becoming fluent in the gospel's language and practices, of being oriented by that purpose in ways that give a message that enables us to be a city set on a hill, a light unto the nations, we've all too often been cavalier, throwing away our own best insights until we find that other disciplines and other modes of inquiry are talking our language, claiming our insights in ways we have forgotten, serving as a mirror to the world's brokenness and destructiveness rather than as a window, rather than as a light, rather than as a city offering signs of God's grace and God's love. Too often we've been crook-backed and cavalier. And rather than being focused on making disciples of Jesus Christ through effective and strategic leadership, too often we've been settling for being caretakers of institutions whose dying may be at a very slow pace, but when looked at over time provides a steadily downward trajectory that can make us ill-equipped to pass on the faith to our descendants, or maybe even only our successors. When we think of ourselves only as caretakers rather than as people who have been called to the most exciting adventure and mission there is in the world, serving the most exciting cause we could possibly serve, bearing witness to God's reign that should call forth from us the most dramatic and committed leadership, because we know that it is the life that really is life, as 1 Timothy 6 puts it. and being compelled by that vision in ways that lead to transformation and growth and the spread of the gospel. What the Wesleys called spreading scriptural holiness across the land. We too often have been caretakers. Crook-backed, cavalier caretakers. The challenges are before us. And yet, even though, in spite of, or indeed I would suggest because of the challenging times in which we live, we're called and invited to bear a transformative witness through effective and faithful Christian leadership that is what the world is yearning for and hungry for. In her fascinating book called Leadership Can Be Taught, which is an account of Ron Heifetz's pedagogical style in teaching classes at Harvard, Sharon Parks begins by noting, leadership is a word that carries a lot of hungers. It holds a lot of hungers. It holds a hunger for personal agency, for authority, for ways of dealing with the intensification of systemic complexity that we face, for dealing with the issues of adaptive change that we find ourselves struggling with. Leadership is a word that holds an awful lot of hungers. And yet, the truth of the matter is, though I have already been suggesting the phrase Christian leadership, the truth of the matter is that in the church we have at best an ambivalent relationship to the word, much less to the practices. I want to adapt a set of principles that come from Andy Crouch's new book called Culture Making. It's a wonderful little book, and I commend it to you. He's talking about ways Christians have tended to engage culture. And I want to suggest that his 4 C's are ways that we have engaged the notion of leadership. He says all too often we get into a condemning posture. You hear the word leadership and you say, oh, that's a business term. And we're not about business, we're about the gospel, we're about faith. And so we condemn any use of secular leadership language or resources as if it's in and of itself a betrayal of the gospel. We become oppositional to it. Sometimes we even say things like, well, the more faithful we are, the more likely we are to decline because discipleship is costly and hard and there are fewer people who make it all the way to the cross. We have all sorts of clever ways of explaining lack of effectiveness. But condemning, once it becomes a posture, just makes us reactive. At other times, it's not just condemning, but it's critiquing. We're willing to entertain the notion, but then we say, but let me show you all the ways in which the business literature is wrong. We're not a profit-making enterprise in the church. We're not focused on power and authority. We're focused on servanthood. We put it into, again, an oppositional framework, but now where we get to stay settled in as the criticizers, the prophetic critique. The convenience of that posture is we're never called upon to actually offer our own account of what we are doing. We get to sit in the position, ironically, of authority, criticizing others. If we leave the posture of condemning or critiquing, we then turn to, all too often, copying. We think that somehow somebody else has figured it out, and so we say, well, just like McDonald's has been able to put a franchise on every corner of every new community, that's what the church ought to be doing. And we simply copy the strategies. And when we do, we fail to recognize the tensions, the conflicts, the challenges that come when we wrestle with those issues. We're not called simply to copy what others have articulated as if they were putting together a fully adequate theory. But copying maybe even sounds a little better than the 4th alternative, the other C, and that is consuming. When we get sufficiently desperate And we realize that maybe we're not going to be able to copy everything. We simply consume everything we can, and we want to get 7 techniques to growing your church tomorrow. And we consume whatever the latest fad is as a way to try to forestall or turn around the decline. It becomes a problem when we simply consume because, again, we check our theology at the door, and we simply get caught up in false alternatives. Now, what Crouch suggests Christians are called to do in relation to culture is to become cultivators. I like the image. It has an image of an ecology. It has an image about what is constructive, about how we are called to hold together and to develop a vision of what we're called to be and to do. In that sense, we're then called to develop our own Christian understanding of the leadership to which all God's people are called. The title for my lecture this afternoon actually came from a conversation we were having in leadership education as we've been developing that initiative and the programs that can be a resource to Christian leaders in a variety of ways. We've wanted to learn and to engage others who are engaged in this work in very important and often really imaginative ways. And so we were in a conversation with leadership team at Duke Corporate Education. And we were wanting to learn how they design initiatives and how they do creative work. And it was quite impressive to hear both their pedagogical understanding of how they think about learning and how they then design programs. As they described it, one particularly really interesting initiative emerged. It was right after Sarbanes-Oxley had been passed, and the role of accountants and auditors were changing. And so the first thought was, well, what we really need to do is to have a seminar where we instruct people about the new Sarbanes-Oxley law. As I was hearing this description, I began to think about all the seminars I've been to in church and academy where we were informed about some new change in regulations or some day-long training session. They said that probably won't be effective because we're really wanting to change a whole imagination. So what they decided to design was an exercise where they hired actors to be medical patients, and they developed charts of what these medical patients presented as possible illnesses. And they had it with sufficient complexity so that there were some presenting possibilities, but they usually were wrong. And the real diagnosis would require a lot harder and more imaginative work. They then asked the accountants and auditors to go pretend they were doctors and to do the diagnoses, and over again, they got the diagnosis wrong. Because, for example, one patient said that he never drank. He was a devout Baptist, and it turned out he was having significant liver difficulties because he, in fact, did drink. As they began to realize that they were making bad diagnoses because they were looking at the wrong presenting issues, a whole new window opened up for their reflection. And they now were ripe for learning in fresh ways. Imagine what might happen in other settings with similar kind of creativity. Well, we were learning all this, and I was just enraptured and thinking all the ways in which we could develop similar kinds of initiatives and experiences for pastoral leaders and Christian institutional leaders, and it was exciting. We were learning so much, and then one of the people from Duke Corporate Education, who was still trying to figure out what we were wanting to do, said, well, after all, what's Christian about Christian leadership? It wasn't a trick question, it was a genuine one. And it was one actually born out of a sense that they have, that the church actually has an awful lot to offer to the wider culture, including to people with whom they work. But they wanted to know, were we just trying to do corporate education's work on the cheap? Or is there something distinctive about Christian approaches to leadership? What's Christian about Christian leadership? What's at stake for us? Well, in the first instance, I would suggest it's about thinking both terms together. to be about the cultivators of a Christian understanding of leadership that holds these two words together. That it is about leadership. It is about the call to become effective leaders, but in ways that are shaped by our convictions, our practices, our rootedness in God. That it is the source of our understanding. It is the purpose and the direction in which we are called to move. It is the shape of the practices, the habits, the relationships in which we are involved. Christian leadership, at its heart, has to do with the kind of vision that anybody can be called to in whatever settings they might find themselves. So it's not just the leadership that pastors exercise or what it means to be chair of a committee within the church. Christian leadership is a way of understanding the call to leadership that is applicable to people who are in a small group or who are called to leadership of large, complex organizations or political contexts. It is the leadership practiced by Christians wherever they find themselves, wherever we find ourselves. At the same time, it's also and particularly critical and crucial that it be that which those of us who are entrusted with official positions of Christian leadership, leading Christian organizations, local congregations, broader institutions, the whole ecology of relationships that enable Christian life to flourish. Because those are the places and the contexts that ought to be laboratories that illumine the call to faithful leadership in whatever settings we find ourselves. I interpret, at least in part, the judgments of the last month as a judgment on the church, partly because we don't know how to talk well about a faithful use of money. We haven't done an articulate job of thinking about Christian economics. We haven't articulated what is at stake in those ways. We haven't preached it, taught it, embodied it. And so we abandon many of our people who work in those arenas to a faithful exercise of their own leadership. If we aren't modeling it, enabling it to be a laboratory for the wider world, why should we be surprised if things fall apart in other contexts? Christian leadership is about thinking those things together. Heifetz's description of leadership as mobilizing people to tackle tough problems, to tackle the adaptive challenges, is crucial because it moves us away from the great person theory of leadership. Oh, for so long the literature suggested that if you just get the right person who perhaps has wholesome good looks and a nice personality, who has that kind of charismatic sense, then we can just entrust everything to them. Except, we all know that change in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean anything good. Some of the most dramatic change makers have wreaked the most havoc and destruction on our world. All you have to think about is some of the political leaders of the 20th century, or unfortunately at the dawn of the 21st century, who oppress their people, who persecute, who kill, who leave legacies of destructiveness. So that the focus on leadership as mobilizing people, of mobilizing communities, of engaging people to tackle tough problems together is a crucial enterprise that I will suggest in more detail is at the heart of Christian leadership. And yet I also want to suggest that we not lose the significance of raising up Christian leaders. People whose lives have been shaped and transformed by the power of the gospel. What we have to recognize is, in the first instance, that's not just talking about pastors. The call to leadership as Christians is rooted in the call to discipleship. It is about equipping all the saints for ministry, and it's part of the same pathos that we have got into of condemning and critiquing and copying and consuming that we all too often have lost sight of the significance of lay vocations to Christian leadership. It is at the heart of what all are called to through baptism. And key leaders do make a difference. But it's not because they have some inborn charisma, but rather it's because of a different constellation of a way of life, of a cultivation of habits and practices, of the support of friends and a broader network of relationships, a theological imagination, a Christian imagination. So what would that look like? I want to suggest it has to do with 3 G's to overcome the 3 C's I described earlier. Instead of being crook-backed, we have to return to that emphasis on practicing spiritual disciplines. And the G that I want to focus on here is God. Unless our understanding of the call to leadership is rooted in the God whom we worship, we'll have gotten off track at the very beginning. I remember when our oldest son, Nathan, was 10, we had just moved to Duke, and he was trying to figure out how to explain to his kids what Susan and I were doing in Durham, why we'd moved from Baltimore and uprooted his life and everything else. And he'd asked what a dean does, and I said, as we were coming home from soccer practice one day, well, a dean's kind of like your principal at school. That made some sense to him, and so he figured he had a handle on something he could explain to his friends. It seemed a lot more complex than what other parents did for a living. Then he said, what is a divinity school? And I said, well, and I named off a whole bunch of our friends whom he knew who were pastors. And I said, it's where people like that go to learn how to preach and to teach and to lead a congregation. And he said, oh. And I was feeling very proud of my ability to help him understand so he could interpret. And there was this kind of moment of silence. And he said, don't you think you all ought to talk about God? Yeah. How often in the church do we talk about activities without focusing on the source that calls us to life? About focusing on that way of life rooted in the practice of prayer, the cultivation of spiritual disciplines. Recently, a group of us were reading a book I would commend to you by Atul Gawande. Both of his books are really interesting. The first one's called Complications. This one is called Better. He's a surgeon. He writes for the New Yorker, and he writes these wonderfully insightful pieces about the practice of surgery and the practice of medicine. And it's got all sorts of interesting analogies if you can stir your imagination to think about ministry. But the first chapter is not really about surgical practice. First chapter of Better, it's entitled Washing Hands. And it's about an interesting and perplexing phenomenon that will lead you not to want to go to a hospital. The most critical factor in the rate of infections in a hospital has to do with the failure of medical personnel, particularly doctors and nurses, to wash their hands frequently enough. And so there is this problem that infections spread, and you're likely to get an infection wholly unrelated to the reason you entered into the hospital because of a failure to wash hands. And so what he's describing is that medical administrators are in the habit now of getting system engineers to design ways to ensure that the medical personnel will wash their hands frequently enough. That includes designing clever ways to put soap dispensers right next to the bed, to find ways that don't require any water to be used to just get it all onto your hands so that you'll do it frequently. And it's really a fascinating chapter about all that. We were reading it, and I rather cavalierly was suggesting that throughout the book there were all sorts of insights for Christian leaders in Gawande's discussions that I said, there are analogies we can draw to everything from washing hands to polio in India. And then somebody said, what's the Christian institutional analogy to washing hands? And I was thinking, dumb thing to have led with. And then somebody else said, prayer. that a Christian institution ought to be a people of prayer with the same frequency, focus, intensity that a hospital is around washing hands. That it begins to orient us to a whole new way of thinking. And then I recalled hearing about Methodist Le Bonheur Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, known throughout Memphis as a praying hospital. And a story about a board member who no one knew was the board member going to visit someone and seeing the custodian of the hospital who stopped and said to her, "Ma'am, may I help you?" And she said, "Well, I'm looking for whatever room it was." And he said, "Are you going to visit a family member?" And she said, "Well, I'm going to visit my brother-in-law." And he said, "Could you tell me his name so that I can pray for him?" And she was so taken by the fact that here was a custodian who had caught the sense of what it meant to be a praying hospital. Rooted in a Christian understanding of leadership is an infusion of that way of life that says spiritual disciplines and being a people of prayer, for which prayer becomes a part of who we are in all that we are and in all that we do. That centering in God, Philippians tells us so much. Kevin Armstrong and I write about that in Resurrecting Excellence, but it's a crucial element when we think about Christian leadership. You know, Philippians 2 and James 3 has this phrase, selfish ambition, and challenges us to overcome it, which suggests that there is an alternative to selfish ambition. It's an ambition for the gospel that then in Philippians 4 gets filled out and fleshed out. But importantly, it's rooted in a better translation of that word that we often translate as the mind of Christ. In Philippians 2:5, right before the Christ hymn, have this mind that was in Christ Jesus. So our English translations suggest. But the Greek word there, phronein, has a much richer sense. A better translation, although more cumbersome in English, would be something more like, have this pattern of thinking and feeling and perceiving and living among you that was in Christ Jesus. Stephen Fowle articulates this quite well in his commentary on Philippians about how it's a patterning of a way of life rooted in God that shapes our imagination, it shapes our emotions, it shapes our perceptions, it shapes our lives. Because when God is at the center, it's about the shaping of character, about a way of being in the world. At the heart of who we are is our vocation as children of God, and then discovering that as it is shaped by God, thinking, feeling, perceiving, living. Look at Philippians 4, verses 4 through 9, and you'll see that same movement, the richness of desire and thinking and living, all bound up together. Because it's about character. And what happens then is you begin to develop an imagination that is rooted in God. Rather than being focused primarily about what I think or what you think, we begin to try to reframe the world to see Christianly, which, to mix the metaphors now, is both to see more broadly on the horizon than we thought we could see, and to see that which is in front of us much more deeply than we ever could have imagined. To see through God's eyes, to see other people, including those people with whom we work, to see challenges, to see the world in the light of the gospel. What happens when we are centered in God, when we're focused on the practice of spiritual disciplines and our people of prayer, patterning our lives in thinking, feeling, perceiving, living, it means that we become attentive to virtues. To virtues, the fruit of the Spirit, to those ways of identifying what is crucial to well-lived lives. Now, this is one of those occasions, and I'll come back to it in a little bit, it's one of those occasions when, dadgummit, the business world is finding our own insights that we have squandered. Words that the business community and business literature, leadership literature is now talking about. They're talking about soul. They're talking about courage. They're talking about humility. They're talking about values. These are words that are deep in the heart of the Christian tradition, and yet we've too often settled and forgotten them ourselves. I want to suggest very briefly 4 virtues that I think are centered in our relationship with God and that are crucial to the cultivation of that way of life that enables Christian leadership. The first of them is interpretive charity. We need this desperately in local churches, in seminaries, in every Christian institution. We need it more broadly in the culture. We need it in political campaigns. We need it in our families. Interpretive charity is the commitment to interpret what our interlocutor, what the other person or persons are saying, in the most charitable light possible. It doesn't mean you agree. It doesn't mean that you ignore and just let it go in a passive-aggressive sort of way. It means that you start with the presumption that they might have an intelligible reason to think what they think. Hardest paper I ever was asked to write in my own education was a paper in an ethics class where I was asked to take a view I hold strongly and go and read the opposing views and write a paper defending the view I opposed. Drove me nuts. Why should I have to go read books written by idiots? Until I discovered that they actually had some pretty poignant, sometimes compelling reasons for their views. Didn't change my own, but it meant I had to enter imaginatively into their own way of thinking to try to understand what gave rise to their convictions, and in the process, interpret them charitably. There was a department, fortunately not at Duke, where the disagreements had gotten so ugly that they finally brought in a consultant because they could never finish a meeting without it breaking down into shouting matches and arguments. They finally brought them together. And the consultant said, here's the next rule for your next department meeting. Here's the basic principle. No one is allowed to speak until they first articulate what the previous speaker has said to the previous speaker's satisfaction. Well, this just put everybody up into arms because it meant that you couldn't sit on the edge of your chair because you know what that idiot's going to say, right? It means you have to actually listen to it and then repeat it to their satisfaction. I imagine running through a lot of your heads is, that sounds like administrative board meetings. It turned out to be the last piece of advice the consultant needed to offer. Because once people had to learn to listen carefully enough and to interpret the other charitably enough, the conversation changed. It didn't mean there were fewer disagreements, but interpretive charity held that together. What's underlying that is a conviction that when you see the world as God sees it, in the first instance you see the other as a child of God whose views are intelligible, even if you differ from them. The second virtue is truthfulness. Leaders live by words. And it's critically important that the words we speak, as well as the words we pay attention to, that we attend to, be articulated as truthfully as possible. It simply won't do to hide our real convictions until we get behind closed doors. To be truthful also means that we'll often be silent. The person I know who is the most truthful person I've ever met has simply said that he's learned just to be quiet more often. How often I wish I had just been quiet. We end up committing ourselves to things as a way to fill the air, as a way to diminish socially awkward circumstances that get us into all sorts of messes. But to be truthful, to be people of our word as we follow the word, is at the heart of what it means to be rooted in God. Third is the virtue which I already mentioned: courage. To have the courage to be truthful in public, not in the parking lot after the meeting, not on the prayer chain, not when you get with your buddies whom you trust, but to be courageous and truthful in public. To have the courage of our convictions, to have that backbone to make the hard decision, to not flee when the going gets tough, to be willing to take risks. It requires courage. Now, Harvard Business Review had an article not too long ago called "Courage as a Skill." I was delighted to see that they were on to the importance of courage. But friends, courage can't be a skill. That's called bravado. And we got way too much of that. The virtue of courage, as Aristotle pointed out many years ago, is the virtue between rashness and cowardice. And it actually requires a centering that's extraordinarily important. The fourth virtue is humility. Humility is the recognition that while I do know things and have convictions, while I'm called to be truthful about those and to be courageous in their exercise, I don't know it all. One of the ways in which we've consumed leadership literature, although it's usually the bad kind, is to make ourselves out as experts. And out of our insecurity that we don't know what it means to be a Christian leader, we think somehow then that means we have to be an expert and know everything. It's the mistake of the first-time pastor, the mistake of the first-time teacher, the mistake of the first-time dean in your insecurity because you're not sure whether the people really believe that you have any idea what you're doing, that you want to be the expert and know it all. Humility is that passage from Paul, we see through a glass but dimly. Now it's important to recognize that we do see. We do have convictions. We do have understanding. But through a glass dimly, we don't know it all. Oh, I remember how comforting it was the first time I was reading Augustine's sermons fairly systematically, and I came across this passage where Augustine said, you know, I keep trying to understand this passage, and it just doesn't make any sense to me. He said that from the pulpit. I thought, well, heck, if Augustine, as smart as he was and as famous as he was, could get up and tell his congregation, I don't get it. He said, I keep praying about it, I keep studying it, it just doesn't make any sense. I take comfort in that. Now, I think you'll be aware, at least anybody who's spent any time reading Aristotle or the like, that these virtues go together. The unity of the virtues, the disunity of the vices. Sin and vice scatters. The virtues gather together. If you want to be interpretively charitable, you're going to need courage. Center of our life, whether in a divinity school or a local congregation or wherever it might be. It's then about the shaping of a way of life, a vocation, whose source is the life that really is life. So the way to cultivate those spiritual disciplines is not to be crook-backed, burdened by the daily, but rather to be focused in God. The second, learning Christian faith. We can't be cavalier. We're called to be faithful to the gospel. So the second G is to be gospel people. To be gospel people is about learning the Christian faith, so that becomes our primary language. And I don't mean that only in the very basic sense of knowing the scriptures, which is itself a challenge in our day and time. Indeed, for clergy and faculty and leaders across the church, The book that became The Art of Reading Scripture, I was privileged to be part of, with a group of 15 people sitting around a table trying to talk about what it would mean to claim the art of reading Scripture in fresh ways. And finally, at one point, David Steinmetz turned to the rest of the group and he said, "Do you realize that the 15 of us sitting around here all represent ways of engaging the Bible that some of our forebears would have thought every one of us should be capable of doing?" I thought, well, there's that. But I want to suggest that it's the art of interpreting Scripture more deeply than just knowing the words, the phrases, the texts. It's knowing the contours of the whole story of Scripture. What Wesley called the whole tenor of Scripture, from Genesis to Revelation. A lot of the leadership literature now is focusing on the power of storytelling. Howard Gardner, in his book Leading Minds, suggests that the most transformative leaders in the 20th century were people who had one of two characteristics, and most often both. One of them was a strong sense of character, sense of presence. By that he didn't mean charisma. John the 23rd made his list, and if you've ever seen pictures of John the 23rd, this is not somebody who would have been a Hollywood movie star. A sense of character and a sense of presence. But the second thing Gardner said was they were powerful storytellers. People on his list included John the 23rd and Gandhi and Martin Luther King, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, Margaret Mead, Robert Maynard Hutchins. Pretty diverse group of people, but what he said they had in common was powerful storytelling. Well, friends, at the heart of Christian leadership is that we bear witness to the best story there is, the most comprehensive story. The story of the creation, redemption, sustenance, and eventual fulfillment of the world. And we are called to bear witness to that. And it's a crying shame when we manage to make Sunday morning worship boring. When we come out of worship, as happened one Sunday morning, when our kids were young, and one of our kids turned to us and said, "Mom, if the preacher doesn't want to be there, why should I?" Alas, we didn't have a very compelling response. To be storytellers is to locate your story and my story, to locate the local congregation's story, the story of an institution within the larger context of God's story. To give it a purpose, an intelligibility, an orientation that helps understand what is at stake in that. Now there's more to that point than might first meet the eye. This isn't only about how we preach and teach. It's also about how we envision leadership. In Sam Wells's book, Improvisation, he talks about the story of God's creation and eventual consummation of the world as a 5-act play. He's getting it from Hans Urs von Balthasar. It's not Sam's original point, but he puts it to very significant usage. Because what he points out is that we are Act 4. So there's creation, there's the story of Israel, the story of Christ, and the life of the church before the fulfillment of the kingdom. And what's significant about that is what our role is in the story, in the drama. If we're in Act 4, friends, the final act isn't up to us. That's good news. And Wells suggests that should give us the creativity to experiment, to innovate, to explore, because we're Act 4. Everything doesn't hinge on us. That's extraordinarily important for us to remember in times like this, when it feels like things are falling apart. Improvisation has at its root that freedom that comes from knowing where we are in the story and bearing witness to it. But at the heart of that story also is a drama about human sin and forgiveness. And both are central to Christian leadership. When we lose sight of our capacity for sin ourselves, or in broader organizations, we tend to get overly optimistic, which is very different than the virtue of hope. We get confused, and we think that somehow we can keep selling derivatives and we can keep doing credit swaps, and somehow mysteriously everything will be just fine. We fail to recognize the ways that greed, that despair, that envy fuel so much of what goes on in our daily lives. We also forget that forgiveness at its heart is a call to a new life, a life rooted in God. It's not about expertise where everything is flawless and everything's going to go directly according to plan. There's vulnerability and there's risk. And forgiveness ought to be at the heart of any person, much less leader's practice. When we lose sight of the drama of sin and forgiveness, we tend to either glorify our own possibilities or become prematurely despairing of anything at all. When I say sin and forgiveness, I'm talking centrally about the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, what I referred to earlier as patterning our lives in that way. It means an incarnational understanding of our life together, which is a challenge, particularly in our culture. Harold Bloom, 20 years ago, wrote a book called The American Religion, and he didn't mean Baptists, Methodists, or even Protestants. He meant Gnosticism. And by that, he meant that we tend to spiritualize everything. Now, the trouble is, Bloom actually thinks that's a really cool thing. So he was celebrating the American religion. It's part of what explains the fascination with the Da Vinci Code and all sorts of other pop spiritualities. But when it comes to calls to leadership, we've lost any sense of the incarnation. We tend to oscillate back and forth between Gnosticism on the one hand and Epicureanism on the other. We're either denying the material world or we're indulging it in its full glories, false glories. To think incarnationally, to think Christologically about Christian leadership, to think about the heart of the gospel here, to learn the Christian faith means that we have to begin to take words like power far more seriously than we do. We've adopted the prophetic rhetoric of speak truth to power, which in many contexts is centrally important and was crucially important, for example, in the black church's prophetic protest against injustice in American culture. But now we've turned it into a stock phrase that too often presumes, I've got the truth, somebody else has the power. And we often blind ourselves to thinking about the Christian use of power. Andy Crouch, in the book I referred to earlier called Culture Making, says, when was the last time you ever heard about a sermon about the wise use of power? We need to cultivate ways of thinking Christianly about power, about stewardship of power, about learning how to do it as servants. But it's part of a much longer history because it's rooted in an understanding of institutions as part of the gift that God gives to creation. Luther, in his lectures on Genesis, says, even if Adam and Eve had never sinned, the law would still have been given to give form and structure to a way of life. Sure, it's a complicated story of Israel and institutions and judges and the exercise of power, and there's prophetic critique of that. But we live in a time where we need to be able to articulate what's at stake in a Christian use of power. Authority, after all, is the legitimated power. And what, in the Methodist tradition, do bishops say to every person upon being ordained? Take thou authority. But unless we're able to articulate what that means Christianly, we'll either become Gnostics or we'll become indulgent of the most coercive kinds of power. More broadly, learning Christian faith through the gospel means that we will take institutions seriously as platforms that enable the gospel to be lived. The root of administration is ministry in its Latin origins. And yet, if I had $1 for every time somebody told me that I had left the ministry when I went into administration, or when somebody told me that their gift just wasn't administration, or they were a preacher, not an administrator, the question is not whether or not you're going to do administration, it's whether you're going to do it faithfully and well or poorly. We need to find ways to take institutions as life-giving possibilities that are also capable of constraint. They have to be articulated and narrated within the larger story of God's purposes, but they give shape and form to ways of life, and thereby are crucial. At its heart in this second principle is what Roger Martin has described in a really interesting little book called The Opposable Mind. It's a business book. It's written by the dean of the business school at the University of Toronto. But his argument is that the best leaders are people who are capable of seeing things in tension that other people pull apart. Now, friends, I would say to you, that's the heart of the gospel. And the most faithful witness to the gospel is when we have an opposable faith that holds things together, finds new ways forward, bearing witness to the reign of God, the power of the Holy Spirit at work in our world. Part of what that means is thinking words together that we otherwise want to push apart. So thinking about Christian leadership together, or resurrecting excellence together, or gospel ambition together, or holy money together, eschatological planning together, traditioned innovation together, loving institutions together, servant power together. The list could go on. It's about God, it's about gospel. The third G, challenging our tendency to be caretakers rather than people who make disciples of Jesus Christ through effective leadership, strategic leadership, is goal. Now, if it wasn't alliterative to come up with a G, my preferred word here is telos. But after I had given an assignment in class where I asked students to reflect on the telos of Christian ministry as reflected in several books, and a student was unsure what the word meant, she Googled it and reported back to me that when she Googled telos, 6 of the first 10 references that came up were articles of mine. I decided maybe that wasn't as fruitful a word. But goal is capable of being reduced into a technique. So I say it with some hesitation, but it's alliterative, so it's going to do for today. But it's about the directedness of our ministry, of our leadership, about the purpose of what we're doing. When there's a sense of a directedness and a trajectory, it gives an urgency to our planning and our focus. When we think about innovation, we're asking the question, can you give an articulate account of why we're doing what we're doing, whatever that might be? In our day and time, we're likely to have occasionally wandering in, even to the most isolated rural congregation or the most struggling urban congregation, wherever it might be, people wander in who are just absolutely perplexed as to why you stand up when you do and sit down when you do and kneel when you do. Can you give an articulate account of why? The question is not whether you've started a school or a family life center or a new outreach ministry. Can you give an articulate account of why, of how it bears witness to the reign of God? It's about developing effective strategies, articulating what's at stake. There are different ways in which we talk about the vision of leadership, about making that vision become a reality, of working with the people, of evaluating that process. Various people have other kinds of ways of summarizing that, but whatever the list might be, it's about having a directed purpose that leads to ways of measuring it and articulating what's at stake. When I said traditioned innovation, it's not just doing things new so that we can keep up with whoever's down the street, copying or consuming, but rather articulately in relation to the faith, being in mission. I want to suggest to you that it's about Christians becoming more socially entrepreneurial. Entrepreneurship for the common good. Let me read to you 5 phrases from my colleague at Fuqua, Greg Dees' description of social entrepreneurship. He says there are 5 characteristics of social entrepreneurship. The first is adopting a mission to create and sustain social value. Adopting a mission to create and sustain social value. Second, recognizing and relentlessly pursuing new opportunities to serve that mission. Recognizing and relentlessly pursuing new opportunities to serve that mission. Third, engaging in a process of continuous innovation, adaptation, and learning. Engaging in a process of continuous innovation, adaptation, and learning. Fourth, this is the scary one, particularly in this day, acting boldly without being limited by resources currently in hand. That's the courage point. It's not rashness. Acting boldly without being limited by resources currently in hand. And fifth, exhibiting heightened accountability to constituencies served and for the outcomes created. Exhibiting heightened accountability. Now, friends, I would submit to you that if we spent a long time just unpacking each one of those 5, I could suggest and defend the view that every Christian renewal movement in the history of the faith has been socially entrepreneurial in that way. It certainly is the case for the Wesleyan movement in the 18th century. It's part of the insight that's been at the heart of who we are. But it's shaped by a sense of a goal, of a telos, of a directedness, of bearing witness to the reign of God. And it ought to lead us to a sense of urgency about serving that mission. The great thing is we don't even have to really adopt a mission. It's good to clarify a local church or an institution's mission within the larger mission, but we've got a mission already given to us by God. We don't have to figure out what's our special purpose for existing. Christian leadership, being thought together, is a way of overcoming the tendencies to be crook-backed or cavalier or simply a caretaker of a dying institution. It's a way of giving hope to new life, whether for individual people, for communities, congregations, for the larger ecology of the Christian movement. It's also a way of thinking words together that our lay people who are in business and social work and teachers and doctors and nurses and lawyers are longing for a vision of what the church's role in the ecology of flourishing and thriving communities can be. What's at stake for that? Well, I want to conclude with 3 brief words and then an image. The first is that I think we will think Christian leadership most faithfully when we read widely and engage diverse others in conversation. The best book I've read about the people called Methodist isn't really about the people called Methodist, at least in the last year, but it's a book about Muhammad Yunus and the founding of the Grameen Bank. He's not a Methodist, but he sure behaves like one. It's an extraordinary account of people gathering in small groups. It stirred my imagination to wonder why we haven't reached out to the poor in similar ways. Except then I realized I just have too narrow a sense of we, because when I was in Côte d'Ivoire in September, I was talking to the head of the United Methodist Women in that country, and she was talking about all the work they're doing in accountable discipleship through microfinance among poor people. And I thought, oh, it's my limited imagination that's there. To read widely, to engage diverse others, to give us different lenses to stir the imagination. Second, and closely related, Effective leadership requires an ongoing learning strategy for ourselves and for the people we serve and for the whole organizations of which we're a part. Learning throughout life, for the youngest of children to the oldest of adults. Josh Waitzkin, who was the original person about whom the movie The Search for Bobby Fischer was written, when he became a young adult, he no longer wanted to play chess, and so he became a martial arts master. And he said it was the same commitment to learning that was far more significant in learning two different activities than native ability. It said it requires a learning strategy. Quick social science example. Two groups of kids in two groups. One, they were told they were brilliant. The other, they were told that they could learn. They were effective learners. They gave one math test to the kids. Everybody did fine. The second test was impossibly hard. Everybody failed. The third test was a manageable test. The kids who'd been told they were brilliant struggled and failed. The kids who were told they were effective learners did just fine. The challenge of Christian leadership is about a commitment to learning, not whether you have tremendous charisma or not whether you can preach like the greatest preacher or were given all of the gifts and fruit of the Spirit, but a commitment to learning and growing in that leadership. Third, again, closely related, it's about developing an improvisational spirit rooted in a Christian imagination. Seeing more broadly on the horizon, more deeply in what is right in front of you. The image that I want to leave you with is that Christian leadership is about cultivating artistic skill and ability. Two quotes for you about that. The first is from John Paul Lederach, whose book, The Moral Imagination, is a beautiful account of reconciliation and what's at stake, and his account is a way of trying to deal with the limits of what he had devoted a lot of his time to, a technique-based approach to reconciliation, and he now wants it to be rooted in imagination. He says this, as artists, aesthetics requires certain disciplines from us. Be attentive to images. Listen for the core. Trust and follow intuition. Watch metaphor. Avoid clutter and busyness. See picture better. Find the elegant beauty where complexity meets simplicity. Imagine the canvas of social change. Or some of the closing words of John Amos in Marilyn Robinson's Gilead. It has seemed to me sometimes as though the Lord breathes on this poor gray ember of creation and it turns to radiance for a moment or a year or the span of a life, and then it sinks back into itself again, and to look at it, no one would know it had anything to do with fire or light. That is what I said in the Pentecost sermon. I have reflected on that sermon, and there is some truth in it. But the Lord is more constant and more extravagant than it seems to imply. Wherever you turn your eyes, the world can shine like transfiguration. You don't have to bring a thing to it except a little willingness to see. Only who could have the courage to see it? In this world in which we live, in these challenging times, perhaps we have been called to bear witness to Christian leadership in such a time as this.